All right, here's section 4.5, where we're taking what we did in 4.1 through 4.3, and we're simply turning it around. And instead of being given an equation and sketching the graph, we have a graph, and we're trying to find the equation for that thing. So that means identifying amplitude, stuff like that. So remember, y equals k plus a. I'll write sine, but it could be sine or cosine. We'll have to think about that. Bx minus h. All right. So it may sound like a lot, but to some extent, a lot of it goes fast too. There's 6 things to figure out here. All right, 4 letters, K and A and B and H. Then also, what trig function, sine or cosine, and plus or minus in the middle here. All right, so we're going to simply look at these graphs and from there figure out what's going on. All right, so here's the first graph, and there's actually sort of multiple cycles in here, so we're going to have to identify period and things like that. First off, if we look at it, the first step is figure out where those peaks and valleys are. So this is clearly the top, and -6 here is the bottom. So the center line would be halfway in between those two. And once we identify the center line, we've got the amplitude. Or, in other words, this is a span from -6 to 12. That's 18 units. So 9 units would put us right in the middle. 12 minus 9 right here. So there's our center line. All right, and that much right there tells us, okay, k equals 3. And also, this distance then, well, that's our amplitude from the middle up to the top or down to the bottom, and that's 9 units. So just like that, k is 3, a is 9. All right. So, and if our top is at 12, you can actually see we're actually right here on the y-axis is where one of the peaks is. So we can consider that the start of one cycle. All right. And now we'll come back to it. So then, if this is the start, how long is one whole cycle? So if we go down, we've gone all the way through all the values, and we're back once we get to right there. All right, so here's the start, and this, marked off at pi, here's the end. So this distance right here is p. All right, now, first off, let me note, we started at 0, so h is our horizontal starting point, so apparently h is 0. P looks like, well, distance from 0 to pi. P is pi. But remember, that's not what this number is. All right, the period comes from that number, but it isn't that number. All right, the formula for the period is 2 pi over b. And b has to be the number that makes that come out to be pi. And you can pretty clearly see that, well, then b has to be 2. Okay, so that's all our letters, and now it's just a matter of, well, we started our wave at the top and went down, and that is the sign of a positive cosine function. So if we put all of this together then, y equals k plus amplitude, plus because it was positive cosine, and then there was no shift, so there's no parentheses in here, but b is 2, so just 2x, like so. And there it is. So on the next one, well, let's see. Gotta pay close attention here. It looks like we have, yep, -3 is the bottom. And almost there, if you were to take this across, yep, looks like 5 is the top. So from -3 to 5, that's 8 units. So half of that would be 4. So this is 4 units. So here's our center line. So we got k equals 1 and an amplitude of 4. So here's our center line. If we were to sketch that in, well, this is pretty close to the top, but it's not at the top, not like in that last one. So our basic wave is not going to start there. What we want to look for a starting point is sort of the first occurrence of a peak, a valley, or a center point, a middle point in our graph. And well, that didn't quite start at the peak, so if we just move to the right, the first time we hit any of those is right here. So we hit a center point right there at 2. If we consider that the beginning of a wave, then, well, we go through, we get our bottom portion, we get our top portion, and we're back once we get to, looks like 12. So here's our start. So h equals 2. Here's our end. And we need to know this distance. There's your period. And well, from 2 to 12, that is 10. And that will allow us to figure out b. So, and one way to think of that, well, if we multiply both sides by b, divide both sides by 10, it just makes these two guys switch places. So b equals 2 pi over 10, which is pi over 5. So that's all our letters. And now looking back at this, we started in the middle, and it's the sine function that starts in the middle, but it's going down, so that is a negative sine function. So putting it all together, 1 for k, minus 4, negative sine function, sine b was pi over 5, and x minus h, which was 2. There it is. All right. Last one of the first side here. Okay. So, where are we going here? First off, looks like our bottom is at 2 and our top is at 14. So from 2 to 14, that's a span of 12. So half of that is 6. So here's our center, right at 8. And here's our amplitude. So we have k equals 8. Amplitude is 6. All right. So our center line, well, boo, 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 here it comes. And it pretty much looks like we're starting right here at 8. So we can take that to be our starting point. So start at 0, and that would be h equals 0 then. And we go down, we go, and we complete our whole wave, and we start repeating right here. So the one issue we have with this, however, is that this is not marked off. And we could actually go through and figure out what that is without a whole lot of trouble. But there's another possibility here that we could use. And I need to pause one sec. Okay, yeah. We're back at it. That was me preventing the cat from causing a disaster over there. Okay. Moving along. Oh yes, so without that marked off, we can't really identify the end unless we do a computation, but there's another alternative here. And this is just one of the things that happens with trig functions. Instead of this being our start, and maybe you would have kind of missed that as being on the center if you didn't draw this, let's think of this as the start instead. Oops, h equals, looks like 1/10. So if we consider this to be the start, then we would do a full wave when we go all the way up to the top, come all the way back down, and finish here at a very nice marked 1/2. All right, so end at 1/2. So I'm getting a little messy here. Here's your period then, and we would have to actually compute it. It's whatever this distance is, so 1/2 minus 1/10. So in other words, 5/10 minus 1/10 is 4/10, which is 2/5. There we go. Now, the period isn't going to change if you pick a different starting spot. That's just going to be what it is no matter what. If we look at it this way, though, if this is our starting spot, well, we're starting at the bottom of the wave and going up. That's what happens when we have a negative cosine. So if we consider that, if we consider 1/10 to be the starting spot, then we're looking at a negative cosine function. And we can say then y equals 8 negative 6 cosine. Slow down. Period is 2/5, but remember that comes from 2 pi over b. We didn't figure out what b is yet. So we need b to be something that gives us 2/5 when we plug it in here. Now clearly b has to have a 5 to make the 5 show up, and it needs to have a pi to cancel the pi. So in fact this gives us b equals 5 pi. So 5 pi and x minus 1/10. Alright, now if we had done that differently, if we had taken this to be our starting spot and run with that, we would get a very similar looking equation, except this, as a starting spot, would give us a negative sine function instead. And so we wouldn't have the 1/10 here anymore, and we would have a negative sine instead, and just 5 pi x inside. And even though that's different, it's actually the same function. Remember, the cosine graph is just the sine graph shifted over a little bit. So in fact, all of these guys, they sort of have, most of them have a pretty natural, most straightforward answer, but they could all be changed into a cosine or a sine function if you adjust what you consider to be the starting spot. Okay, there's 3 on the back. At this point in the video, it makes sense if you went and did those and gave them a shot and see how they go. I'm just going to move right into them and go over them, but go ahead and pause, see if you can do them. You can check the answers on the filled-in versions of the 4 or 5 notes online, or watch my doing of them in just a sec. And that's what I'm going to go do. Okay. So, weird new camera. Okay. So here it is. What do we got with this guy? Well, sure looks like we hit our peaks and our valleys at plus and minus 11. So our center line is right here at 0. So amplitude 11 and k equals 0. Done and done. Also, we're starting right here at the middle. So that's nice. That's our start, so h is going to be 0. There's 3 of our 4 letters already. And if that's our start, we go down and do the bottom half, do the top half, and here we are having finished. So here's the end. So when you start at 0, that number is the period, in fact. So the period is 2 pi over 3. Which comes from 2 pi over b, so pretty clearly b equals 3. And all we got to do is figure out what function. Well, starting in the middle, going down, that's a negative sine function. So y equals 0, which we don't have to write, negative sine function, so negative 11 sine of 3, and there's no h, so we don't need parentheses. We can just put our x in there, and done. And moving along. All right. Looking carefully, I think we get the top at 11, and the bottom actually at 1. So 1 to 11 is 10 units. So half of that is 5, and that makes halfway in between 1 and 11. 6 is our center line. So k equals 6. Amplitude from 1 to 6, from 6 to 11. Amplitude of 5. Alright. Now, at 0, we're not at the top, the middle, or the bottom, so that's not our starting spot. But the first time we do hit top, middle, or bottom is right here at 1. So here's our start. H equals 1. And 1 full cycle, would finish off right here at 9. So that distance, that's p, and it looks like 1 to 9, that's 8. So 2 pi over b needs to be equal to 8. So again, if we play switcheroo, multiply by b, divide by 8 on both sides, 2 pi over 8 equals b, so in other words, just cancel a tiny bit, b is pi over 4. And, well, we started in the middle and went up. And that is a positive sine function. So, y equals k, plus, since it's a positive sine function, 5 sine. B is pi over 4, and h is 1. There it is. That's what that guy is. And the very last one then. Well, here's the top at 4, and bottom at -10. So -10 to 4, that's a span of 14. So half of that is 7, so our amplitude is 7. And -10, if we go up 7, we're right here at -3. So that's our center line, so k is -3. So at 0, we're not at the top, middle, or bottom. If we follow the graph, though, the first thing we hit of those 3 is a top point at pi over 12. So here's our start. So h is going to be pi over 12. And starting at the top, we finish the cycle right here. So here's the end at 7 pi over 12. So the period is going to be this distance. So from 7 pi over 12 to pi over 12. How wide is that? Well, that's 6 pi over 12, which is just pi over 2. Alright, now that comes from 2 pi over b. So what does b have to be? Well, it needs to cancel that 2, no 2 over here, and we still have to get a 2 on the bottom. And pi is still there, so b doesn't have to have pi in it. And if you work through that, b is going to be 4. So we got our 4 letters. But then like we saw, this guy's starting at the top. That's what happens with a positive cosine function. So putting it all together, y equals -3 plus amplitude cosine. B is 4. H is pi over 12. And there it is. Barely fitting in there. Alright. That's the gist 4-5. That's what we're doing with it. Nothing really conceptually new, just using all that same facts that we had before. From 4-1 through 4-3, just doing them in reverse. And so that's it.